Okay, make a right onto Route 666. Oh, hello, scary story fanatics. Welcome back to Cleaving Thought from Bone with your host, Sociopathic. Glad you were able to find your way back. I've been planning my route for an upcoming trip. A killer tour, sure to slay hundreds dead. One would think the quickest path between 2 points is a straight line, but there's so many sights to see along the way. So, before heading off, get comfortable and lock your doors, and listen up for an enriching terror tale that I like to call The Fence Down the $1 Million Highway.
How many of you guys, or girls, whichever the case may be, are the outdoors type? I have always been the outdoors type. This is not to mean I've never seen anything unexplainable or unsettling, because I have, but it's so rare an instance, it leaves my love of the woods unfazed by these things. And besides, these odd occurrences are always accompanied by some kind of rational and logical explanation. Well, except for that damn fence, anyway. Ah, yes. The fence in Milford Woods, just down the $1 Million Highway. Okay, at this point, I'm sure I've raised a few questions, so let me address them one by one. Firstly, the $1 Million Highway. What is the $1 Million Highway, you ask? Well, that's a funny story. Funny if you don't live around here and pay taxes anyway. A few decades ago, when the highway between New Milford and Halstead was being constructed, it originally followed a different path than it does today. Workmen and architects were brought in and cleared a dirt path through the land between these two towns, cutting through the middle of a dense forest where pylons and pavement would be constructed for the purposes of the highway. The residents of the nearby townships had their taxes increased to pay for the project, which developed the area for a period of a couple of months, before entirely abandoning it and resolving to build in accordance with the new path the interstate takes and stands today. This, in turn, extended the time it would take to complete the project and the amount of money it would take, and therefore, the taxpayers would have to fund it. The state gave everyone some bullshit reason of geographical layouts and rock formations as to why the site had to be moved, but I'm pretty sure no one really bought it. Suffice it to say, people were pretty pissed off with their county representatives and voiced their frustrations, but in the end, the architects and higher-ups would have their way, and a dirt path that leads 30 miles into the wilderness until reaching a small town on the other side still exists. A monument to the frustrations of a small-town community and bearing a name that speaks to the lost funding sunk into the abandoned project, the $1 Million Highway. Now, as you might imagine, despite the land being deemed a national game preserve and visits after sundown being strictly prohibited, the place is a hotspot for local parties. And I don't just mean teenage parties either. All kinds have ventured out there to spend the night on the side of the dirt path, in the middle of the woods, always coming back to tell their tales from what I understand. Granted, most of these stories were just those of a night of debauchery in the woods, but a few were more. 3 or 4 of them even shared a common trait, and from what I honestly believed, was not staged or planned between these parties. Rednecks hardly go to such lengths. Some spoke of eyes in the woods, others of sounds, odd smells, but all of these depicted the same thing. An isolated fence in the woods with no apparent obvious purpose. Now, I'm 32 years old, and would like to believe I've grown past the stage of my life where a weekend keg party is the norm, but camping out with a couple of close friends, with some good kind bud and a bottle of whiskey, is my idea of a great time. It was my friends Jake and Chris who told me the story of the $1 Million Highway a couple of years ago when I had moved to town. Two good guys who worked at the local recycling plant and helped introduce me to the local wildlife. You know, the kind on two legs. Anyway, last week the three of us were out at the local bar, a small hole-in-the-wall place called Harmony Creek Pub, and was just almost quaint enough to call it home. While sitting in the back of the establishment, not far from the jukebox, an old friend of Jake's came over and leaned in beside him. The conversation started light, mostly about their day at the plant to begin with, but slowly tapered off into talks of Benny, a local who knew both Jake and his old buddy quite well. "What do you mean no one's seen him? I thought Benny just tied one on last night like always. You sure he's missing?" "Yeah, I'm sure. Supposedly, he's been missing since Sunday afternoon. Melissa said something about Benny headed back to the $1 Million Highway with a few of his buddies. No one's seen him since." Jim, Jake's old friend, informed him. "You think?" Jake started, but Jim cut him off. "I don't think. I know." Jake's eyes grew distant, and I was about to speak up and say something, but Jim cut me off. "Don't even think about it, Jacob. There's something living in those woods that's best left alone." It is then that a patron began calling Jim's name from the other side of the bar. Jim turned to face his friend one last time, bid him farewell, and left to attend those who called him by name. "So, let me guess. Going for a hike tomorrow?" I asked Jake, rhetorically. "Hiking? Shit, man. I might just camp." "You can't camp out there, man. It's all posted and illegal and shit." Chris must have managed his way into the bar without our noticing. Seeing as how you couldn't see the front door when it was busy, it was no surprise. "What's illegal?" Chris cut in loudly and startlingly, giving both I and Jake a slight jolt. Once he had realized who it was, Jake hushed Chris, scolding him for speaking so loudly, and had him take a seat, a pitcher of beer between us. I honestly didn't see the big deal. The joint was so full of local drunks and punk newbies in their early 20s being so rowdy. It's not like anyone could have heard us, even if they had been paying attention. Christ, I was sitting right next to him, and I could barely hear him. But to make a long story short, before the following pitcher had been emptied of its frosty brew, we had resolved ourselves to an overnight trip down the $1 Million Highway that coming weekend. So, the reason we had all resigned ourselves for waiting until the weekend for the excursion was due to work inconveniences. Honestly, not even Jake expected to find anything, other than a possible clue as to where the group had headed, but none of us really expected to find what we did. Basically, we had parked the car on the other side of the paved road a few hundred yards from the $1 Million Highway and began our trek. We were essentially ignorant. Let me tell you, ignorance is not bliss. Now, some of you may be wondering why we parked the vehicle instead of driving the old dirt path. Well, Jake was the only one of us three to own his own car. Seeing as it was a sports car, he refused to drive it on a rutty old road and insisted we walk. Of course, we had expected this. He did tell us it would be a hike rather than a drive, and we both knew the terrain very well. There was no way Jake's car was making it the whole 30-some-odd miles without at least losing a muffler, but in all likelihood, it would have eventually gotten stuck, leaving us stranded anyway. Why any of us would have decided this was a good idea is still somewhat beyond me, but the only thing you've got to remember is that there isn't really much else to do around here. So this was simply another night out to us. So with the sun blazing above us and the shadows of the trees blending with our own, we began our hike down the long dirt road, known only to the locals as the $1 Million Highway. It had likely been a few hours, but honestly, to me, it could have been a mere minute, and I wouldn't have noticed either way. The three of us had smoked 3 or 4 joints and had been passing around a gallon jug of Rebel Yell bourbon whiskey. But when the sun began to set, enveloping our surroundings in an ever-increasing shroud of twilight, it became clear it was time to set up camp for the night. This didn't mean tents or anything like that. It only meant building a small pit to contain a fire and breaking out a few food provisions we had brought with us. Nothing more. There was no need for blankets or a tent. It wasn't going to rain anytime soon, and we had the whiskey to keep us warm. Well, while I was gathering rocks to place around a small hole that Jake had dug, Chris ventured off into the adjacent forest to retrieve some firewood. Needless to say, Jake and I became intrigued by curiosity when Chris yelled out, "Hey guys, you gotta come take a look at this!" A sudden movement at standing upright and a few more calls from Chris, and we arrived at his side, beholding the sight he had called us over to see. It was a fence. A tall, almost new-looking chain-link fence that seemed to stretch on longer than any of us could see in either direction. Though, granted, the woods out here are so thick and the terrain hilly that line of sight was greatly inhibited. At first, the three of us were dumbfounded. There were no keep out signs, no posted tags, nothing. The forest on the other side of the fence looked just the same as the trees that surrounded us on our side. But once again, it was growing darker by the second, and none of us could see very far. Maybe some of you would have just gone back to start the fire. After all, it was just a fence, right? But we all knew this place really well, and there wasn't a building or structure for literally miles, and this was all sanctioned for national conservation. So why was this fence here? And for what purpose? The three of us just couldn't let it go, and began walking the perimeter in hopes of gathering more information as to the length of its diameter and possibly what was contained inside. Stoned and drunk, the three of us stupidly hiked that fence line until well after dark, so when Jake and I heard a clanky rattling behind us in the dark, it gave us all a startle. It sounded like something was climbing the fence. "Chris, is that you?" Jake called out. "It was just me, guys," he responded. We backtracked towards the sound of his voice in the dark, stopping upon seeing him on the other side of the fence. A quick explanation revealed the dumbass had simply climbed over right where we stood. Now, I should mention that the fence was pretty tall, about 15 feet or so, and none of us wanted to try climbing it. Besides, steel wires that comprised it were thinner than what you'd expect from a normative chain-link fence and threatened to slice into flesh if too much pressure was applied. But Chris, that ingenious, intoxicated fool, noticed a tall tree on a small hill growing beside the fence on this particular spot. Deeming it easier to climb a tree than the fence itself, he used it to scale the height of the fence. One of the branches of this tree hung over the fence and drooped towards the ground on the other side. We should have scolded him, but enthusiastically, Jake and I followed suit. I was first to meet Chris on the other side, and Jake was right behind me, but in our intoxicated state, no one considered the extra weight of 2 morons dangling from the same branch. With a loud crack, Jake and I tumbled to the ground beside Chris, a broken tree branch on the forest floor beside us. Jake and I stood upright and inspected ourselves for injury. Finding nothing, the three of us had a good laugh, not realizing the true, ominous nature of what had just happened. Now, no one had a light. The canopy was so dense there was no moonlight at all, so we were left in utter darkness on all sides. In the midst of our chatter and commentary, I don't think any of us heard it at first, but one pause by all three of us, and it was clear that something else was inside the perimeter of the fence with us. There was a distinct whispering coming from the darkness, but it seemed to be coming from all around us. It wasn't too unsettling at first, as for the first couple of times we heard it, it could have just as easily been a gentle breeze blowing leaves about in the dark. But there was no breeze. I honestly can't tell you who saw them first. No one spoke out. I think we were all just too shocked. In the dark before us, staring the three of us down like a predator sizing up its prey, were a pair of gleaming yellow eyes. But these were not the eyes of a bobcat or other such a forest animal. These were far too large, and the way they heaved and jittered alongside the black mass that shimmied along with them in an unnatural way, covered in the dark of night, had a way of making you feel uneasy, like this thing was wrong. When I was little, I had a black shepherd named Rascal. He was my best friend growing up, until one day, Rascal got hit by a car. I remember running to the scene of the incident and my dog landing sight on me. His spine was broken and one of his legs was completely turned around. His entire frame was misshapen and twisted, and yet somehow he still tried to move towards me, his owner. This gruesome image of broken, painful movements was unsettling in the same way as this thing that now ventured closer to the three of us. And the way it moved, it was not all that dissimilar from my mangled dog, like its frame was twisted too. I heard a crashing noise to my left, and when I turned, I saw it was Jake. He had turned tail and ran. "Jake!" I called out to him and made a few steps in his direction. And then I stopped and thought about Chris, not wanting to leave him behind. I turned back once more to see Chris, but what I saw was much, much worse. Chris was there, but something had him. It fucking had him by the face. I saw pleading eyes behind the pale, talon-like fingers of the monster that now gripped him by the head. Behind Chris, I saw the thing's face. Black eyes that seemed to gleam yellow from their centers. A face so wrinkly, weathered, and pale, I knew this thing was never once human. It was completely devoid of hair, and its mouth, the thing's mouth was filled with rows upon rows of tiny, pin-like teeth, and it seemed to stretch open far wider than what should have been possible. I expected it to take a bite out of Chris, to lunge at me, but to my surprise, the thing let out a powerful, almost deafening shriek at me before retreating backwards so fast both it and Chris were hidden by the black void of a night-shrouded forest. Here's where my memory gets blurry. I can't tell you how many times I changed direction, how long I looked for Chris, or how long after I gave up and looked for Jake. All I can tell you is that it was dark. I was completely turned around, and I was alone. This haze of confusion was broken when I heard Jake's voice. He was yelling at something. The closer I got, the more I could hear the sounds of banging metal beneath his frustrating verbalizations. When I gained sight of Jake, he was crouched by the fence, holding a large piece of slate in his hands and using it to bash against the chain links at one of the posts. I think I startled him because when he realized I was there, he turned at me like I had suddenly come up on him without his realizing, and he looked scared. "I almost got it," was all he said before returning to his work at hand. I heard the rustling of leaves behind me, and I turned away from Jake to look. But that's when I heard him shout, "I got it!" causing me to avert my attention back to him. He was peeling the fence away from the post at its corner. He had done it. Jake stood to face me, opened his mouth to say something, but no sound came out. He looked surprised. Before I had a chance to ask, he simply said, in a turned whisper, "Hey Chris, where the hell have you been?" That's when I realized he wasn't looking at me. I turned to face behind me to see Chris standing there. He looked completely apathetic, like nothing had happened at all. "Dude, I saw you get—" "Come on, guys," Jake interrupted. Seizing the moment, I dropped the topic for now and followed Jake through the fence. Chris followed suit. The path back was dark, the terrain rocky and formidable, but we ran it just the same. Jake and I side by side, Chris always just behind us. A few times I thought I heard Chris say, Where the hell? A couple of times. But it didn't sound like him. But it was so soft, and our footsteps so loud, I really can't be sure. Out of breath and panting heavily, we made it back to Jake's car. I watched Jake get into the driver's seat before I climbed into the seat beside him. Chris jumped in the back. I know I didn't blame Jake when he said that he was just going to drop us off and call it a night. None of us could really explain or even understand what had happened to us that night. We dropped off Chris first. When he got to his front door, he just stopped and turned and looked at us. Jake and I thought he'd go right in, so he began to drive away. But as we did, Chris simply turned and stared at us as we drove by. He hadn't said a word the whole way home, and his behavior was more than questionable. But I don't think either Jake or I really wanted to talk about it. With a good night, and I'll catch up with you tomorrow, Jake dropped me off at my house, and I went inside to bed. Nothing else to tell. That is, until the following morning. It was the weekend, so the fact that I had been sleeping in was surely no surprise, but the frantic banging on my front door was certainly a deviation from the usual. With a sigh and a stretch, I climbed to my feet and headed for the door, opening it to find Jake. Jake looked observably shaken and pale, as if he had seen a ghost. I asked him what was wrong, and for the longest time he said nothing, even after I invited him in and sat him down on my living room couch. We did bring Chris home last night, right? His question puzzled me. Of course we did, and surely he knew it. Yeah? Why? I asked, somehow knowing I'd regret it. And I was right. I don't know why the $1 Million Highway was abandoned. I don't know what that fence in the woods is for. But I fear that it may have been purposed to contain something, to keep something. Something that we may have let out. Jake told me with a voice nearly as shaky as his hands that was impossible. That we couldn't have given Chris a ride home the night before. Chris's body was found mutilated about halfway to New Milford down the $1 Million Highway, discovered by a conservationist that morning. The corpse was eviscerated, partially dismembered, and the nearly unrecognizable remains of Chris insinuated that he had been dead since around midnight. I checked the clock when I got inside my house. That was impossible. We had dropped off Chris at his house at almost 3 in the morning.
So what was the name of that town again? I surely intend to stay away. Then again, all roads paved with good intentions lead to hell stead. But if you're not ready to make a U-turn and leave good horror behind just yet, just make a pit stop right here again next weekend. And until then, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can catch you all again next Saturday.